I'm ostensibly here to introduce my boss to the stage, but far be it for me to miss this opportunity to speak to you about my pet project, all right? So first, I got two questions I want to ask the crowd. For the sci-fi geeks in the crowd, how many people are watching Mr. Robot? Okay, it's good, isn't it? Okay, it's good, right? How many love Mr. Robot? Okay, the rest of you, you're fired because you're not good enough to be part of this, okay? All right. My second question is, what are you reading? All right, and if you were going to choose, you're going to take time out of your busy life to read some brand new cybersecurity book that you haven't read before, what would you do? Most people would go out to Amazon.com and put in cybersecurity books. I've done this. You know how many books you get back from that search? You know how many that is? 1,500. All right, 1,500. So how do you choose which book you're going to read this next year? Have I got a deal for you? Okay, it's called the Cybersecurity Canon Project. How many people have heard of this? Okay, great. There's a booth out front. You get more information on it. It is a curated list of cybersecurity books done by outside committee members. These are CISOs and CTOs, journalists, lawyers, consultants. They read the books, write a book review that says, this is a book you should read, or this is a book you should let someone else read for you, all right? So go check it out if you want to, all right? All right, so the congressman talked about public-private cooperation, which is fantastic. He talked about the cyber moonshot, which my boss has announced it last year. So with no further ado, let me give a warm welcome to Mark McLaughlin, the CEO of Palo Alto Networks.
Morning, everybody. Thanks, Rick, for taking some of my time. I appreciate that. I'm already negative 4 minutes on my clock here. Really appreciate you taking the time to be with us this morning, and thanks, Mr. Chairman, for the comments as well. It is an important time in cybersecurity, and having everybody really gel around that's a critical topic for the nation. So I wanted to talk about two things today, both under the headline of the coming disruption in cybersecurity. So at the very highest level on that disruption, it's one thing we'd like to see, I think collectively like to see, and then another thing I'll talk about, which is a subset of that, which is more technical in nature, something that I'm pretty sure is going to happen. So the thing we'd like to see, and I'll jump to the kind of where I'm going to end here and start with it in the beginning, is the idea that we need a national catalyzing leadership on cybersecurity to move beyond incrementalism, whether I think it's the government or industry or education system. It doesn't matter what organizations we're talking about. A lot of what gets done today in cyber, my view, is incremental in approach. It's important because we all have to push a rock up a hill every day, right, and whatever our roles are. But what it seems to maybe lacking is the idea that it is so important to life in the digital age that we need a catalyzing national leadership around this to have what we term the cyber moonshot, right? We've proven as a nation a few times in our history that if something is that important to fundamental way of life, that we can actually rally around it in ways that we can look beyond minimal years and in political timeframes and do something very important at a big picture. And the one that we'd like to posit, have for over a year now or so, is the idea that can we make the internet safe in 10 years? Right now, as soon as I say that, I get beat up many times on that because all the obvious questions come up about what does that mean, the difference between putting a man on the moon and bringing it back versus something nebulous like what's it mean to be safe on the internet. I've heard them all. You can give me ones later on that, but the basic point in that is basically, can we rally as a nation and then as an international community to say it's important enough that we have to have a very ambitious goal like that, and that we would liberate our thinking in order to make that goal come true. When you start thinking like that, lots of things come to mind. We just had a breakfast meeting. We discussed this morning with some leaders in the DoD, and we immediately started to talk about supply chain. We started to talk about the education system. Started to talk about technology. We talked about many, many things, right? But the point of that is those are all important. They're all necessary. But what's the goal? How will we define success here for all the fantastic efforts that are actually happening today? All the resources that are being put against cybersecurity, as Chairman Ratcliffe said, I would agree, it's not a resourcing issue. Perhaps it's a focus issue, right? So if I jump to the end of my first disruption, which would be, can we have disruptive thinking? Can we free ourselves to come up with a very, very ambitious goal, say 10 years' time, So it's a short period of time in many ways, but a long enough period of time that is non-political in nature and enough time to get organized to say, let's make the internet safe in 10 years. And if that's what we wanted to do, what would actually have to happen behind that? And what would we have to do as a nation to make that true? So that's my first disruption, which I'd like to see happen. The one that's underneath that, more technical in nature, things that we actually know a little bit more about because we're not diplomats, we're not law enforcement, we're not educators in our industry here, we're technologists, right? So let me talk about this disruption that would have to happen in order to make that first disruption true. And that is, how do you actually harmonize a dissonance that's been happening for a long time in security, where we know there has to be tons of innovation, but the actual consumption of the innovation is killing us from an operations perspective? Let me start at the top here. The first is that I think we're all very well aware that we're living in the digital age in the first place. Everything we do in our personal lives, our professional lives, is all underlined by digital technology. That's a good thing, right? One of the reasons it's such a good thing is it drives an increasingly large amount of productivity in business and in our personal lives. Productivity is actually critical, right? Because we have population growth, we have a lot of people in the world, and we need more and more technology to work to our advantage in order to support everything that's happening in the world today. Now, we know, though, for those of us in the cyber realm, that the flip side of that coin is that when you're relying on digital technology for everything, it's actually the digital capabilities themselves that creates the problem, right? And that's the problem today, which is in the digital age, the trust is eroding very rapidly, I think, right? And if you think about digital capability sets and technology, whether they're applied to business, whether they're applied to elections, whether they're applied to banking systems, whether they're applied to your personal information, the trust that things are right is just as important as what the reality is, right? So I think it's been pretty clearly proven that even with very significant real issues from a cyber perspective, it can be just as damaging as to what the perception is, as opposed to what the reality is. It actually doesn't even take the creation of cyber havoc to wreak havoc. You can just create the perception that the underlying information or data itself is no longer valid, right? And the perception itself will become very bad. But today, when you think about all the breaches we see or election issues we see along those lines, what's happening is we're burning the trust down very quickly, and the very thing that makes all the productivity super important. So what if we got to a point as people, as a nation, as a global community, where we said, I just don't trust it anymore? Not completely, meaning I'm not going to use any digital technology. I just don't want to use this much anymore. I'd like to see the bank teller again. I don't want to use electronic capability sets for my health records. I want to vote in a certain way. It's all got to be physical, right? Because I don't trust things anymore. The impact of productivity on the nation, the global economy, would be staggering, staggering. Right? So it's super important, if you just think about it, whether it's national security concerns or economic concerns or just productivity concerns, that we restore and regain trust here in the digital age. That's increasingly difficult to do because the adversary knows that, right? They're working against us on this. And they're taking advantage of the continued decline in cost and compute power. So sometimes I get an opportunity to speak to boards of directors and, I'll call them non-technical folks, right? This is what I'm telling them, which is if you think that the cost of compute power is going to keep going down, as it has for a long time, if you believe that Moore's law is in effect, and it still is and will be for some time, the adversary gets to take a lot more advantage of that than you do. All right, so if you believe in the cost of compute power going down over time, what that means is the adversary is going to launch more attacks, more sophisticated attacks, and for less and less cost over time. That's our reality. We're not going to change that reality, okay? What we have to do is to say, what do you do in the face of declining cost of compute power that have some downstream impacts? Most importantly, that we're dealing with a highly, highly automated adversary who continues to be automated in nature. At the same time, we're dealing with the exact opposite when you're on the flip side of this, right? And in addition to that, with the capability sets that we're bringing to bear in order to combat the highly automated adversary are becoming very fine-tuned in nature. All right, so if you're a CIO, a chief security officer, a CTO, and you have buying responsibility for cybersecurity capabilities, this is probably what the line outside your door looks like, right, from people like me, right, our industry, which is, I have an answer for you for something. Right, so earlier I said, how would I take all these great ideas of innovation and actually operationalize them in a way that can make sense when the adversary is becoming increasingly automated? It's a very significant challenge. And the answer to that, we think, is that we have to use automation and orchestration and leverage to our own advantage as well. Right, the capabilities to do things in highly automated ways, increasingly orchestrated, and getting more and more leverage from growing ecosystems, so none of us is fighting the adversary ourselves. Those exist, and they continue to exist and grow in nature just because technology keeps moving forward. So how do we harness all that innovation and automation to our own advantage as well? And very importantly, understand and accept that no single company, no single entity, no government agency can actually do all the innovation that's required for security themselves. We can't. I'll admit that for Palo Alto Networks, right? We cannot do all the innovation for security. We cannot do everything for you in security. We'll never be able to do that. Self-awareness is actually very critical here from a security perspective. So if you take the idea that you have to have lots and lots of innovation that no single entity can do, you have to have it in increasingly automated ways and orchestrated ways and get leverage from larger and larger ecosystems, and you have tons of innovation that has to be done, then you have to have the way to consume that innovation where the usage of it doesn't cripple you. So there's always a battle between the chief security officer and the CIO or the networking folks. We see it constantly of saying, I've got this great security idea or something I actually need, and somebody has to say, well, I got to run that, right? And you just gave me 37 other ones last year, or 42, or 59, or whatever the number is. So even as good as some of these ideas are, how can I actually consume them in a way that itself does not cripple me from an operational perspective? And that's an increasing challenge. And that's led over years to drive to platforms, right? Platforms is a very overused word, like, I don't know, machine learning or artificial intelligence, right? But drive to platforms that are the way to get the automation, the orchestration, and the leverage, and ideally over time, to get them in a consumable fashion so you can have all the innovation and operationalize it as well. And in these platforms, new models are needed, right? And these are the models that are being driven today from an industry perspective of things where you have more innovation and more sharing, more automation, software, ease of deployment, and flexibility on usage, right? These are all things that I think if you said, yeah, I want all those things and I can have all those things, would be really good. Back to the software one, for automation and orchestration, you know, I think that it's probably true that in security, that everything that can be done by software needs to be done by software. If the automated adversary is using that to their advantage, it would be a mistake for us to continue to throw people at an automation problem. People are very, very important, of course, but to think that we're going to actually scale up people into that challenge is a misunderstanding of the problem in the first place, right? So increasingly more automation, increasingly driven by software under models like this are going to be really important for us into the future. And these have been occurring, the good news. These are evolutionary in nature, right? They take time, even though you might have revolutionary ideas, they all evolve over time. And I think the good news in security, and here's this disruption I'm talking about for technology here, is evolving over time as well. And I'd posit that there's been three so far, fundamental ones from a security perspective. But in order to describe them, I have to go back to prehistoric times, right? In the beginning, in the network, when there was such a thing, and there was a perimeter, and everything was, you know, very finely defined, right, and all these things along those lines, there was a really good idea in security that continues to be a good idea, and that is to distinguish the difference between an attack and a successful attack. And the difference between that is one is successful, right? Otherwise, it's just an attack, right? So understanding that would be very important a long time ago, because a successful attack actually had to do a whole bunch of stuff right? And that was terms were coined like the kill chain on that, the attack life cycle, or things along those lines. But the point was that it had to do a lot of stuff right. So could you, take a prevention mindset, could you interdict an attack everywhere it had to do something right, or try to, every word had to do something right, to increase your mathematical probability that you'd be able to defeat it at some interdiction point prior to its completion. Or if you couldn't do that, that you would understand it fast enough that you could minimize the damage. Or if you couldn't do that, that you would have understood it fast enough that you could help somebody else out and immunize them against the same attack downstream, right? So a good idea, still a very good idea. Back in the day, in the dinosaurs, right, the way we did that was he said, industry came along and said, oh, I'm going to fix that for you. And I've got a capability for every one of those interdiction things. And here's this one, and here's this one, and here's this one, and this one, and this one, and this one, right? None of them work together. None of them are automated. None of them are orchestrated. They all take people to run them. To the extent they do anything together or make any understanding, or if you have any understanding of what they do together, you need people to do that. So you need to be the back-end systems integrator, right? So the first evolution was to take those concepts of the difference between the attack and successful attack and interdiction capabilities at the network and say, no, actually, those can be done in software. If you had the traffic in the first place and you could see everything, why can't you do all those things all at the same time? Not next to each other, but simultaneously. Make them native to each other. Do it in software so that when you had that traffic, you could get those highly automated, highly orchestrated prevention outcomes simultaneously with each other, right? So this is a topic that's been proven for quite some time at scale for a very long time now of many, many things that were previously done from a network security perspective by industry that were actual sub-industries, turned out to be software features of a platform. And that was the first evolution, one still going on, very, very important one because it kind of proves the point. The second one then was to say, well, if you could do that for the network, pay attention to the fact that data is all over the place now. The perimeter is dissolved, right? Data might be an endpoint, maybe in IoT devices, it might be in the cloud, it's going to be in multi-cloud environments, it's going to be third-party SaaS applications where you never even see the data in your network. So if you could have those highly preventative answers, the way I described them in a highly automated way, could you have it consistently wherever the data is, whether it's on your network or on your endpoints or in the cloud, all at the same time, with no lack of understanding at all between those data locations, because consistency would be very important, because if you didn't have that, then you'd be accepting a different security posture just because the data moved around. And you'd replicate this issue on the network, which you took decades to fix, which was saying point solution, point solution, point solution, and you'd replicate it horizontally. And you'd say, I accept different security outcomes or different security postures when my data is on an endpoint as opposed to in my data center, as opposed to an AWS, as opposed to the GCP, as opposed to Azure, as opposed to Dropbox. That would be a problem. That's the second evolution. I'd say it's about 4 to 5 years old of understanding that that is an unacceptable outcome. And I'll call it at the bottom down here, across network, endpoint, and cloud, that this is being defined very quickly as an operating platform, where the consistency of the platform and standardization is very, very important into the future, which then allows you to move into the third evolution, which is on us now. Right? And that is to say, if you had that level of standardization at the operating platform layer, you would have massive amounts of telemetry coming off of those things. Right? Whatever you deployed for whatever reason, lots of telemetry. And the telemetry is becoming increasingly important because what's really interesting about security now is what can you do with data? What can you do, and I'll use one buzzword here with machine learning, for example, against very large data sets measured in petabytes or terabytes. What could you do with that that would be predictive and proactive to help drive the automation and prevention outcomes? And the answer to that is, well, you'd have to have a lot of data. Right? If you didn't have the data in the first place, the efficacy of machine learning falls off dramatically. And the second thing is, if you had it and you could use AI and machine learning against it, and you weren't able to enforce the answer at the operating platform level, it's academic. Right? So how do you marry those two things together, which is the future of security being highly reliant on using analytics and data at increasingly large scale, and the ability to operationalize the answers very, very quickly without having to deploy every single capability on which the algorithm rides, right? And that's the challenge that we've seen today. If I go back to my long line in front of the CIO office or go to the RSA conference, I'm sure a lot of you go every year, you're going to see 1,500, 2,000 security companies, right? The reason there's so many security companies is because lots of innovation has to happen because security moves so quickly. But in most of those companies, if you talk to them and say, what do you do? Increasingly, they're going to say, I do something really cool around behavior analytics, network behavior analytics, something around analytics, right? And if you said, I like that a lot, what do I have to do to use that capability? Almost every one of them is going to say, all you have to do is buy my thing and deploy it everywhere. My hardware, my agent, my virtual machine, whatever it is. Now, the reason they're going to tell you that is because it can't do anything in the absence of visibility of the data. So they actually have to see it, right? So you got to get deployed in order to see the data in the first place. The second thing is, even if they can see it, if they can't actually enforce an answer from the data set, what's the point, right? So then they want to be in all the enforcement positions as well. So it's kind of a conundrum, right? So how do you fix that? And we think the answer to this, and this is the disruption that is happening now at the technical level, is to say to marry together the operating platform concepts with all those cool things that are going to happen from an analytics perspective. And that's one of the things we've done here, and I think others will do this as well, is to say, if you have critical mass at the bottom of the operating platform, if you're very widely deployed in networks and on endpoints and in cloud, you're in the enforcement positions already, and you're feeding tons of telemetry into data lakes. Ours is many, 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 many petabytes today. If you're doing that today, what if you opened up the data lake to everybody and said, if you have an interesting idea from a security perspective, ideally something that's driven by algorithms or analytics, instead of spending your time and effort trying to build the next piece of hardware to get the algorithm deployed, to get the visibility to the data in order to be in the enforcement position, why don't you write software and spend your time improving and honing your analytic capability for those algorithms? Write a piece of software and come in through the top of the data lake through an open API and see more data than you're ever going to see in your lifetime, because you're never going to be deployed that widely as the large operating platform players are at the bottom. And the second thing is, can you then enforce those answers through things that have already been deployed? Right? So can we harmonize that dissonance between the innovation and the running that stuff? I came in late from San Francisco, sorry. Running all those things, right, in a way that doesn't cripple you operationally, right? So the answer to that is yes, it is possible, right? And this is the disruptions upon us now, which is having proved that you can take those algorithms out of those highly innovative approaches and run them as software on top of the data set and enforce the answers off the algorithms on things that are already running at the operating platform layer. So you don't have to deploy the next thing in your network, the next agent on your endpoint, or the next virtual machine, right? This is a very important topic, we think, because this feeds on itself. What that means is it greatly encourages lots of innovation from smaller companies to do really interesting things because they don't have to worry about acquiring the data sets anymore. Right? They can see larger data sets than they can ever get on their own. And the second thing is they don't have to worry about figuring out how to raise the funding to build the next thing, to get into the distribution channel, to get the time with the CIO or CISO to convince them to do the POC, to get in the lab, to make the decision to deploy the 47th vendor operationally inside of their environment. Instead, they just turn it on as a piece of software in an app store. Run it against other ones, run it against as long as you like. If you don't like it, don't use it. If you like it, pay by the hour, pay by the month, pay by the year, it doesn't matter. Right? So go back to what I said from those model perspectives of more software and more automation and more flexibility on usage and more innovation. So this disruption, we think, is very real. It's not academic. It's happening right now. We call this the application framework. Right? But we think it's very powerful in nature. We have over 30 companies right now who are writing applications into the application framework to bring them to market. Some of them are our customers, where the application is just for themselves. Some of them are our competitors, where we've invited them to say, if you can do something better than us, you should do it. Right? Let the customers decide on that. Others are some of these smaller companies who are highly innovative in nature, who see this as a fantastic way to market in a very disruptive model, and also that allows for automated work streams between the applications where the customer doesn't have to do the integration in the background. Right, so if we're right on this, or even half right on this, we think we're going to get radically different outcomes. It kind of turns everything on its head in the security industry, which is instead of a drive to having less innovation because there's going to be vendor consolidation because people need that for ROI and all the things that they're talking about today, what if we ended up with a whole different model, which was actually more security vendors? I know when you say that, people go like, oh, we don't need any more security vendors, right? But what if it was, instead of worrying about how I have 72 security vendors in my environment today, or whatever that number is, and how can I possibly get number 73 and make that work with my dearth of funding and manpower and resources, is it possible that we could be standing around here in 3 to 5 years, a very, very defined time frame, which we can see and say, I have 300 security vendors in my environment, and I like it, right? Because they're all software providers to me, running across operating platforms that have been standardized. That there won't be one of those, by the way, but have been standardized to a certain point, and I can consume them very easily. And that's going to change everything in security. It's going to change funding models. It's going to change venture models. It's going to change distribution models. It's going to change how we run and operate things. And I think that'll be a positive. So if I take that back up to the high level and say, that's super important. If we can get that done technically, it takes us a long way to the automation and the orchestration and the leverage that we need to fight a highly automated adversary, which takes us a long way in the technical component of the cyber moonshot, right, of fundamentally doing things different. There are tons of other things that need to be done as well, as I mentioned, in law enforcement and diplomacy, and in our education system, and our supply chain system, and supply chain integrity, and I can go on and on and on. But we shouldn't shy away from those things. We need to embrace them and take them on as challenges that we have to conquer. In our company, this is our mission statement. It's to protect our way of life in the digital age by preventing successful cyber attacks. That's a very ambitious statement, right? Very ambitious statement. It's ambitious by intention because this is what we want our people to come to work and think about every day. If we're not doing that, demonstrably doing that, then we're failing in our mission, right? And if we are doing this, then good things are going to happen not only for our customer base, for society as well. And a thing we'd like to posit above and beyond this is where I started, which is what if we adopted from a national leadership position that our mission is to make the internet safe in 10 years, right? Again, I know there's a lot of hair in that dog, right? And fine-tuning and parsing that need to be done, and we'll talk more about that. We're going to have lots of people to speak with later today and through the course of today. I've spent a long time talking with leaders in government, in Congress, international basis. But the thing that happens every time we talk about it is it gets kind of exciting to say, yeah, can we define success in a very ambitious way and give ourselves an umbrella to work under as a nation and across international boundaries on something that actually matters, right, from a cyber perspective, which is so important back to the fact that we live in the digital age. I'm very confident, I'm optimistic that this can be done. I know that there's a tremendous amount of work that has to be done on this. We're super thrilled to be part of that. We're just a small part of that, we realize, but we're very thrilled to be part of that and look forward to working with you and all the folks that we're going to hear from today on how to make this a reality. With that, I really want to thank you for taking the time to give me a little bit of your attention this morning, to join us for a federal night, not so much for Palo Alto Networks, but as a forum for some of these big thoughts that we need to think about as a nation and a community, and all the ways that we can come together as a community to serve these interests. I hope you enjoy the rest of today. Thank you very much for your time.